So I got to go on Jubilee and film an episode with Alex O'Connor. This episode was one atheist versus 25 Christians, me being one of the 25 Christians. Now, fortunately for me, I didn't have to go it alone. I had a couple friends who were on the episode with me. My friend Than from Exploring Reality, who's joining forces with Inspiring Philosophy, and my other friend Tim from Doxastic Mastery. You can find their channels down below. Now, before we get into the video, just a couple things I want to talk about. First thing I want to talk about my experience with Jubilee. I think they're actually really excellent with how they treated us. They're extremely hospitable. They were really great to communicate with. I really had no issues and no contentions. Every time we had a break, they were walking around, they were giving us water, they were giving us candy, they were keeping us hydrated, keeping us focused. They were really nice to deal with. Unfortunately, I wasn't a big fan of the format. And this is not a fault of Jubilees. They're here to make great content, and that's exactly what they're trying to do, is put out great content, and I think they do that well. But the format in itself, I do not think works. You have 25 Christians who are all trying to get into deep theological issues, and they can only do it in a couple minutes time. Not only that, it was very difficult to actually get up and talk on a subject you wanted to talk about. Me personally, I was only given an opportunity to speak once for reasons I can't get into, and that topic was a topic I wasn't extremely familiar with, but I was comfortable talking about it, so I did go up. The two topics I really did want to talk about, I never actually got the chance to go up for, and that was, did Jesus claim to be God, and genocide in the Bible. So the two things I was really studied for and ready to throw down on, I didn't get to speak on. But without further ado, let's get into the video.
So we're gonna hop right into this. What do we got planned for today?
Well, before we get into it, I wanted to talk to you guys. So we got to go to Jubilee. Tell me about your guys' experience with Jubilee. Like, what was it like?
Dude, I was actually impressed with their hospitality, man. I was like, we filmed for like 4 hours or whatever, and people just, like, everyone listening right now, like, there were people coming rounds, handing me water, sparkling water, sodas, snacks, and everything. I was chilling. Like, after I went up there and spoke, got all the nerves out, I was chilling. I was eating trail mix.
Yeah,
I was
dude.
drinking sparklings. Like,
there's only so much we can really say about how everything was recorded and how we went down. In general, again, like, I just don't think the format is going to be useful for digging into the weeds and getting as deep as we really want to, right? And that was something that was really frustrating. And Alex was frustrated about it too, right? Like, the two times that I got to talk to him, he straight up said, like, I wish we had more time.
So I want to say this one thing too, which is for people to know how handicapped we were. The producers literally said themselves, quote, our group was the most flag happy group. So if you they've had on. So if you go and you like watch my part and you see like midpoint I'm making, I get voted off. That was the status quo. That was the norm rather than the exception. People took it way too seriously that if you want to have a chance to speak, raise your flag. Like, I loved all the people there. Everyone there was really, really cool. But I was like, man, we got to work together on this. Like you can't just get me off right when I'm trying to really hone in my point here. Or like what John likes to say, land the plane. Like, I couldn't even land my plane fully because other people were like, oh, I want to get up there and I want to speak myself. And
and that kind of goes into like what I was going to say too. I don't mean to cut you off, but how do we feel about like the segment of Christians that were there? Because I think that's a big reason the flags went up so much, is because of the group that we had. Do you guys agree with that?
100%. We had people that disagreed with each other, right? Like, get the Mormons out of the equation. We still had people that disagreed with each other on some stuff. And so I also am just of the mind that there's no use of over crying over spilled milk. Like, the format's going to be what it's going to be. And I'm still grateful that we were on there.
Oh yeah, super grateful.
And I think good things happened on there still.
So I think it's going to be Tim. You're going to pull up here first.
Yeah, I'm 3 minutes in. I'm 3 minute mark, I think, or something like that. Yeah, I have yet to watch this, so let's see. Look at that. Yo, that was sick.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is, what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous, or
in particular, non-human animal suffering? Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of Theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff.
So I just want to say real quick, Tim, just from my memory from this, I think you dominated this conversation of like any Christian who went up specifically on the problem of evil. I personally believe that you dominated this one.
Yeah, you did great, bro.
Thank you, friend. I don't even remember. Like I don't remember what happened. Like the moment I sat down, it was just like went into a different reality. So it's interesting seeing how this is playing out.
None of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
How did you feel about that?
Dude, honestly,
Look at
Tim,
them on the screen.
you pulled that off perfectly, by the way. Because
Okay,
if you remember, I don't know if you remember this, but the morning of, remember we were role playing the problem of evil stuff, and I told you, I'm like, dude, be a dork, but don't be too much of a dork. And you put that together perfectly, bro.
Problem. Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing?
What?
Look at you, bro.
Oh, me?
Just
Oh, yeah, okay, look, at this moment, I know exactly where Alex is going. Like, I'm 5 steps ahead in the conversation, and Alex is doing exactly what I think he's gonna do. And that's me just being like, yeah.
you look like a proud dad in a way.
I'm proud of Tim and frustrated with Alex at this point.
I could feel like Than's like support energy. Like when I was sitting there,
Nice.
like we didn't look at each other, but I was like, yeah. I want to say this real fast, and I want the audience to see this. What Alex is about to do is he's about to do this philosophical sleight of hand. And this is not an ad hom or like a psychological thing. This is something that happens a lot. And what I mean by a philosophical sleight of hand is this is not something that's purposeful or like malicious or like he's not a sophist. That's not what I'm saying. He's about to basically conflate two aspects of the conversation as though they're one. And you're about to see that happen. And so I just want to let everyone know, like, all right, put that lens on and try to like hone your selective focus on that. So go ahead, John.
And then with that being said too, something to remember, this is a debate format. So like Alex is trying to win, which is perfectly fine. And when we actually all like went out for dinner afterwards, we got to sit down and just like have a conversation about it, which was more fluid and fun. So like don't ever like he's doing like these certain types of techniques. Don't look at it as like a negative thing.
Alex had a job to do.
Yeah, he had a job to do.
And he was not being dishonest by doing it.
No.
Of untold animal suffering.
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection such that that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee the overarching narrative.
Did you see
Dude.
me?
Dude. Hold on.
Do you see me just hyping Tim up? I'm like, yes.
Okay, so this is a good part to pause because I have people who are even philosophically informed who don't actually know like what I mean by this.
Yeah.
And
I
this is
actually
where
was
could
going
have
to
been a
ask
better
you
job.
that.
Yeah.
What do you mean by those possible worlds? Or a great world?
And this is where, and Than will understand what I mean by this. This is where like it is so hard to make accessible some of these things. Like, how do I say this in 5 words? So when I say that God doesn't create worlds, what I mean is there's
Tim, can I cut you off there for a sec?
Mhm.
Because what might be really helpful is to get people to understand what that doesn't mean first. Because the reason people's flags were going up is because of how they interpreted the phrase "God doesn't create worlds."
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. So what I'm not saying is that I'm not saying that God didn't create like the universe or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that God isn't the source of all things that exist. I'm not saying that God's not the foundation of reality itself. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there are basically 2 ways in which you can understand how God creates. And so God creates, but how does God create? And there's two views. There's one view, it's called the conjunctive view, like a conjunct conjoining things together. And basically it's the view that what God does is he looks at all these possible worlds, all the ways in which every aspect of reality could be. And then what God does is he goes, hey, I like this one that has, and he like chooses, like, I want X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and then I'm going to like create that. And so God basically almost like reaches out into like the annals of time and then basically like, places things where he wants them to be through his foreknowledge, and then basically creates that. It's a pick and choose model. That's a lot of the times what people think we Christians or theists mean when we say God created the world. What I'm saying in this is this is called the disjunctive model, which basically means is that what God is focused on creating is the initial conditions of the universe. So what God does is he creates this initial segment of reality that is going to unfold according to certain set parameters. Now, there's going to be an aspect of randomness, because then the universe is actually allowed to unfold in all sorts of ways. And so through a chancy process, the universe from its initial state unfolds into many things. But the idea here is that God doesn't say, oh, let there be Homo sapiens that are carbon based, right, that will exist on Earth. That's not this model of creation. What this model of creation is really saying is, let there eventually be moral agents. And then God lets the universe participate in the bringing about of those moral agents. And we just happen to be carbon-based creatures that, if you accept evolutionary theory, share common ancestors with chimps. We could have shared a common ancestor with lizards. Something like that. It could have been not Earth. It could have been a different set of things. But what God is basically saying is he's going, hey, I want there to be moral agents. I want there to be beauty. I want there to be order. And then he lets it rip. And that's the idea here. So it's not that God chooses all these different things that are going to happen. It's basically the idea that God creates these initial world segments, and then those unfold over time. But what happens is things as they unfold, they don't unfold in any particular direction. They converge over time into this overall destination. God has a plan for how the universe will unfold over time. And what you'll see on the whole, right, is that the timeline eventually converges to this overall destination. And that's the idea. And that's an idea that I was trying to play out for Alex here, because ultimately the idea is, and a lot of theologians have talked about this, which is we often view the universe in terms of its past rather than its future. And on a theistic worldview, the universe is heading towards perfection, where eventually the tragedies of this universe and everything, it's one chapter in a larger book, and eventually it will give over to like victorious redemption, where on the later half of the universe is happiness, bliss, harmony, victory, redemption. But like on this part of the universe, it's still going through stages, and we see that, right? If you look at the history of the universe, you have the lepton era, you have the inflationary era, all these different eras that cosmologists say that the universe goes through. So we actually see the universe going through these stages. And so the idea here is that, God creates these initial conditions and parameters, but the universe can evolve as long as it's within these parameters. And what I'm arguing for Alex is these parameters are benevolent parameters, right? And so you can kind of get like a little fine-tuning idea there. But that's the basic idea, is that when I say that God doesn't create worlds, it's not that God picked and chose everything that was going to happen specifically. Rather, God sets up the parameters for how things are going to unfold and play. Think about it like chess, right? The game of chess, the terms and conditions are already set. There are such things as legal chess moves and illegal chess moves, but we have this degree of freedom for where I want to put the pawn or where I want to put the rook, right? That's not being determined, but the general parameters and the rule of the game is already determined. And that's the way in which you can think about God's creation of the universe. So there you go, Than. I tried my best. There you go.
No, that was good.
Oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything. The first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at the total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge. Hold on. Like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
So are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life, and suddenly everyone's great.
See, I think he kind of ignored that you're talking about.
And that was just, that's another sleight of hand. You saw that. He said, well, if we're just talking about Earth, dude, Alex, my bro, I was so clear. I didn't even realize I was that clear. I'm actually impressed with past Tim. Good job, past Tim. Whoa.
Yeah, you did really good.
You were pretty clear. He just kind of ignored it.
Well, John, you also have heard this stuff from Tim and I for a long time at this point. Mm-hmm. This was probably the first time Alex has heard something like this.
Yeah. Maybe,
like,
yeah.
And imagine, like, it's the same way that, like, atheists and even Christians that have never heard, like, the max data case for the resurrection that I put up, right? People just automatically go, oh, what's the minimal facts argument? Let me just give this response, right? And that's probably what happened to Alex at this point. He heard something new, but went to something that he has heard in the past and tried to respond to that, thinking that's what Tim's doing. You did an awesome job there, Tim.
I think he actually even asked that clarifying question, pre or post, and then you specified, and then he just ignored it. And it's almost like a play on emotions. Like, well, if we only have this person for this short period of time and they suffer and they disappear, it's pulling on heartstrings, and it seems intuitively correct, but it's ignoring the actual
it's also
argument.
Just inherently disagreeing with something that Tim said earlier, and this is something Tim and I always talk about, which is what's more important, what happens to an agent or what that agent becomes in the end. Right? Is their life on the whole good and something that they endorse and say this was worth it? Right? The question that Alex asked there is answering that question by saying what happens to that person is the most important. Because you could have that child in that hypothetical that Alex put up, but saying that that's going to be evidence against God's existence is affirming that the first thing is more important than the latter. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah. And for the audience, right? Like, we have to understand that what Alex is doing as well. I'm now realizing this. Like, well, one, in the beginning of the conversation, Alex almost, he didn't do it with me, but he did it with the guy previous to me, where he set up the conversation as though he was making some kind of inference to the best explanation argument, where he was comparing two theories. But then, in the kind of conversation he's having with me, he's running a more internal critique based argument. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're going to be running an internal critique, rather than trying to put up a theory, what you always do in an internal critique is you have to take the particular person's worldview on the whole, and then you have to find two things or more, right, that they believe in. Let's say there's two things. There's going to be two things that they believe in, and you have to show that that person cannot simultaneously hold those two beliefs without running into some kind of either logical inconsistency, incoherence, or like tension. Right. And so that's the reason why I kept honing it to Alex, because he says, well, if God exists, this wouldn't be the case. And that would, so like if God exists, X won't be the case, let's say. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. The question becomes, though, is it depends on exactly what the belief X is and exactly what we think the belief God, like what it means for God to exist. And the idea is it's if I'm the person who has the problem in internal critique, right, then he has to probe my own worldview, and he has to see whether or not X actually is inconsistent with the existence of God. And so all I have to do is just show him how there's a consistency, meaning it kind of just brunts the force completely. And so like, for example, here's an internal critique. Let's say there's a guy named Jim, and he's a vegan, right? Oh, and then let's take another statement, right? Jim is eating meat, right? Okay, well, the very definitional nature of being a vegan negates him eating meat. So if he's eating meat, he's not a vegan, right? Because that's just not what vegans do. So you have two beliefs there. Then you can run an internal critique where you're like, well, you say you're a vegan, yet you eat meat. Those two things don't go together. But if he's a vegan and he's eating fruit, well, there's no problem there. That's consistent with being vegan. So what I was trying to have Alex do is like, well, you're telling me that my worldview is like the vegan eating meat example, and you haven't shown me that. And I was trying to get him to like go into the specifics of my worldview so he could show me where I have a problem, because I don't think I have a problem, because I don't think that I have two inconsistent beliefs. So that's just the nature of that. So
grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
I love how I'm like getting more hyped up as he's talking.
They sort of have disease killed by lions are often too big to be killed instantly, so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not.
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can
Do you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that
Yeah,
suffering.
but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why what's the term of necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize.
Okay, so
justified
tell me
You
how.
notice how he just switched words but said the same thing there?
No, I missed it. Hold on.
Yep, watch this.
Which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that
Yeah,
suffering.
but you're saying it's a necessary connection. What's the term of necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize.
Pause that for a second there, because that's something really easy to miss probably. What just happened, right, is that Alex is assuming a value, like a part of a value theory here. And what's going on there is he's saying, well, this is only going to be something like God's only going to allow this, right, if it's necessary for the greater good, which it purports to bring about, right? Tim goes, well, what's up with this necessity kind of a thing? And then Alex just switches the language to say justified. But it's the same thing, because in Alex's mind, it's only going to be justified if that particular event is necessary for the greater goods that it comes to bring about. And Tim can finish it off here, because what we're going to say is, well, no, we would reject that thesis. Go ahead, Tim.
100%. And this is actually what I remember, Than, when we went out to eat after dinner. I don't know, John, you were off to the side. You were talking to someone else.
Diarrhea again.
Yeah, something like that. But I made this point clear to Alex. I was like, dude, Alex, I agree with you. Like my approach here is I don't think justification is based on greater goods or like preventions of greater evils. Like I told him that. I said, I take what's called a sufferer-centric view, which is that if God is going to create an environment where an agent is likely to suffer, then God has to ensure that that kind of suffering isn't soul destroying. So that person has an opportunity to live a good life long term. That's what I believe. So what he says,
including the afterlife, that's a really important piece of the puzzle, by the way.
Right, 100%. And the two things I believe, the two conditions is the afterlife is going to be a place where God is going to bestow the kinds of goods on that person where their net well-being is ensured, but also at the same time that person also subjectively for themselves endorses or at least does not regret what they went through. So this isn't an example where I can destroy all your stuff but give you $1 billion. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that God is not only going to bestow upon them goods, but he's also going to ensure that this person is actually going to consent to their own existence and the particular experiences that they have. That's why it's called a sufferer-centric view. And so when Alex is telling me, well, it's only justified if it's necessary, notice how I kept saying, okay, you're assuming a view that I don't even hold. Like, Alex, you and I both agree. Like, animal suffering doesn't fit that. You cannot run a greater goods defense for animal suffering. And so what I wanted to get into, and you'll see this before I get voted out here, is I wanted to basically say, hey, we both agree that God must be morally justified if he's going to authorize suffering. I just think that the moral justification here isn't in terms of necessity. It's in terms of what we call defeat. That God can defeat the evils in a particular individual's life and then redeem them from that particular life. So that's what I was trying to get him to go there. And So I had to actually explain that to Alex afterwards, and I remember like it finally clicked for him. He was like, "Oh, interesting." He was like, "I wish that we would have." Like Alex literally said, "It's unfortunate that that amount of nuance wasn't
you
able to
needed
come
more
from the
time.
conversation."
You needed more
Yeah.
time because you're bringing a new thing to the table that most Christians won't argue, and so he's probably assuming that you were bringing up other
like I
points of
said,
view.
he's never heard it before.
Yeah.
Tell me
Unjustified suffering.
how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, with redeemability, or we call it defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's
She's agreeing with you, but holding up the flag. She's like, I agree, but I want you out.
This is the stupid thing.
That's part of the format that sucks, right?
Yeah, we were all flag happy for sure. Except when you guys went up, I literally put my flag under my chair. I'm like, I'm not touching that thing.
they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. Well, you're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status. Well, God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give.
I like that. That's cool. I like that
That's
a
John
lot.
Schneider, by the way. If you guys are interested in that view, John Schneider, specifically a theologian, he defends that in a book called "The Darwinian Problem of Evil," where he basically responds to the evolutionary problem of evil.
Give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see
Can
that.
we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer
It's
a
not
bunch.
means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be.
And so he's misunderstanding what you're saying.
Yeah, he's still missing
Back to
the
compensation. He's back to compensation. And this is the sleight of hand that he's doing. He said, "What for?" He's confusing two things, guys. So chat, hone in on this. He's confusing God's psychological motivations, which we may not even ever have access to, and moral justification. Okay, I'm going to say it again. He's confusing God's psychological motivations with moral justification.
Yep.
And a way to give you an illustration, like imagine you see me like making myself a cup of coffee, and you're asking me the question, Tim, how are you morally justified in making coffee? That's a very different question than why did you make coffee? And the reason why I'm saying that is it's a mundane example. It's kind of weird, but think about this. If you ask me why am I morally justified in making coffee, all I have to do is just tell you how I'm not doing anything unethical by making myself a cup of coffee. However, that tells you absolutely nothing about why I even made the cup of coffee. The problem of evil concerns the moral justification part, which is how is God not bad for not preventing suffering? It is not about why did God create an environment where there is suffering? And Alex is going back and forth between the two. So when he says, well, what for? He just basically ignored the fact that I said that God is morally justified. I already demonstrated how God's morally justified in allowing suffering. And he pivots to a different aspect of the conversation as though it's the same conversation and says, well, then why would God psychologically even pursue this policy in the first place? I actually don't need to know that to answer the problem of evil. I just need to show that God isn't bad for not preventing suffering.
Yeah.
That's it. I don't need to know why this universe trends the way that it does. I just need to know that it's within the realm of things that would be indicative of God being good. That's it.
And you kind of touch on a good point there that I think a lot of anti-theists will bring up is they expect Christians to have answers for literally every problem, and they never allow a Christian to appeal to any sort of mystery, which I don't think is fair because a lot of atheists they'll appeal to mystery. They'll say, we don't understand where this came from. We don't understand this
Some unknown natural law caused this miracle.
Right. And so they do that all the time, but they won't give the same gratitude to the Christian when we hit somewhere. It's like, well, I'm not too sure. Right. And I think you're allowed to say that.
Be grateful for the $20,000.
Yeah.
But why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out
All
by
right.
the majority.
Awesome,
Please
man.
return to your seat.
Dang. Is the curse of ham still on me?
Wait. John.
What?
Hold on. Before you go to the next timestamp, keep it going. I'd want, because their hands are in my face. I want to see if it'll capture my look of approval. Darn it. Okay. I was really proud of you, Tim.
Wait, we're okay.
Let's
Thank you, bro.
find where's Than here. There you are. Look at that handsome man.
Yeah, I want to see. I do this. I actually want to see what this looks. This is good. This is good. There's insufficient evidence to believe in the Ooh.
Insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection.
Okay.
Nice to meet you.
How's it going?
This is a really interdisciplinary question for the resurrection of Jesus. And in my experience, it kind of boils down into two categories. The prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus. Wait, pause for a second. Look at my eyes. Can you tell I'm sick?
I'm more thinking about like
yeah, that's it, dude. I was hanging by a thread at this point.
You were definitely were. I
Sorry,
see you,
keep
John,
going.
back there.
Itself.
So what I'm really interested in is the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay, I want to ask a clarifying question because I would love to talk about the data. But if I were to give you a model of the Gospels that I would call like the historical reportage model, which would say something along the lines of the authors of the Gospels were close to the times and places of the historical Jesus. They rooted their historical work in eyewitness testimony and did not feel the freedom to make up historical facts. Because of that, we can extract all the testimonies from these Gospels, and we have access to what the original eyewitnesses actually said and did.
Okay, so who do you think are the eyewitnesses that the testimony is being based on?
So this is where I'm not a walking encyclopedia, but I would say if you looked at all the testimonies, we have 21 unique testimonies that are going to be polymodal in nature. They're going to have semblances of independence and interdependence and some dependence because of the synoptic problem, all that stuff. If we were to get there, would that be enough for you to say the probability that the resurrection happened relative to any other countering theory is higher?
No, I don't think so.
So that tells me then that one...
And that was good because you pretty much got his priors out there.
And we prepped that, guys. You have no idea. Dude, Than already had like a vision board. He like ran this part of the conversation through his head every single night. I remember that like he practically already did this before you got up there. Than, remember that? We prepped this part. It was like, yes, we're gonna get him with this question. That was perfect slayed, bro.
That's something you were prepping since day one. Is like, how do you get to his priors right out the gate? And you nailed that. You got it right there. It doesn't matter if the historic reportage model is solid because he's still not going to believe.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the analogy I'll use here is, if you guys watch anime, you know how like fighting animes, people talk about, they'll do like vision fighting. They'll close their eyes and they fight in their heads with their opponents and all that kind of stuff. I did that with Alex pretty much. So that tells me then that one, it could be the prior probability still. That's an issue. Because if that's not enough evidence...
It's not that. I think that the authors of the Gospels, specifically on the resurrection, can't be trusted to be giving an accurate account of what happened.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking. Right there. Do you know what just happened there?
So he shifted because you said you started off, if they were to shown to be historically reliable, would you agree? And he said no. And then he shifted to, well, I don't think they're historically reliable, so I can't trust it. So he gave you the argument and then he retracted it.
Which... the whole point of me asking that initial question was, if this was the case, would it be enough? He says no. Well, what's the point of even building the case for that to be true in the first place if it's not going to be enough, right? Which is why I wanted to try to talk about the prior probabilities, because I can get him to the historical reportage model then, and he'd still be not enough. So the question's like, why? Well, it's that's a circular argument at that point, right? Well, it's not enough because the historical reportage model is not true. Why? Well, because the historical reportage model is not true. That doesn't add up.
Right.
So
I'm not even sure he was aware he did that. Like,
no, I don't think he was either. I didn't take that to be a malicious thing or anything like that.
Historical reportage model, and that was true.
Sure. Well, if it were true that they were reporting historical events, then it would be a historical event. Yeah.
So let me clarify.
I don't think that they are.
Yeah, I got to recover. Let me clarify one thing here. The historical reportage model does not entail.
Why are you laughing, Tim?
Because you see through everything he's doing. Like, I love that. Like, I love how you sat down. You're like, yeah, I'm not a walking encyclopedia. Anyway, you're like, yeah. I get that part. Anyway, I love it. You're 10 steps ahead, bro.
Thing is that we can extract from there is that these were the actual eyewitness testimonies to the risen Jesus.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that Jesus is the only person outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles rose from the dead? Do you think that he's the only person in human history that's risen from the dead?
Yes.
Okay, so Matthew.
So go ahead.
Yeah, because the Gospels talk about other people rising from the dead. So I'm curious what you mean when you said yes there.
Yeah. So what you saw my face, like if you saw my facial expressions there, that was me doing a probability calculus in my head of where he's going to go with certain things. And I knew exactly where he was going to go. He was going to ask me about the other people that are rising from the dead, blah, 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 blah. He's probably going to try to segue into the raising of the saints in Matthew. That's where I can go into the argument and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So The decision to say yes or no there was me trying to figure out if it's basically, it was me just trying to go, okay, well, what's going to be like the way that's going to best condense that thing that he wants to get into without me seeming avoidant.
Yeah,
Because if I just said no, I mean, yeah, if I just said no, then he could have gone down a way different path, and no matter what, it would have just thrown us off.
So you're talking more strategically rather than you actually believe that.
Well, when I say yes, I do mean that Jesus was the only one to be resurrected, in the sense that he came back to life and stayed back alive, rather than resuscitated, which is a point I make a little.
Okay, I understand the difference.
Matthew's gospel in Matthew chapter 27 says that at the time of the death of Jesus, the graves of Jerusalem opened and the holy ones got out of their graves. And then, interestingly, says then after the resurrection, appeared to many. Many of them walked around appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
So I would just say that if the historical reportage model is true, then yes.
So you think...
But, hold on. The problem there is those are also talking about resuscitations most likely, not resurrections.
Yeah, but what we're talking
Right, so you clarified that there.
Yeah.
about here is the graves of Jerusalem opening and many people getting out of their graves, walking around Jerusalem and appearing to many
If I
people.
say yes, what's at stake?
If this happened, this would be the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in human history. And yet,
And then you're going to make
it
an
is
argument
not
from
reported.
silence from there.
Some arguments from silence do work. It is
I
not
understand
reported.
that, but then
Hold on,
that's
hold on.
only one piece of
It's not
evidence that you're
reported
gonna use.
anywhere else. It's not reported in any of the other gospels.
I
It's not in
understand.
Josephus. It's not
So
in Acts.
that's one
It's
data
not
point.
anywhere.
Let's just
But hold on, let me finish this thought, because this is
So I really hate arguments of silence. There's one that kind of sticks out to me, is that people thought that they discovered like all the pyramids in Egypt. And then there's like a recent discovery like 2 years ago where they found a whole new pyramid under Egypt. So I don't think you can just say because you don't see that it never happened and it's a good argument against something.
Yeah, for anybody that wants to get dorky, nitty gritty here, Tim McGrew is a philosopher. He wrote a paper. It's literally titled "The Argument from Silence."
It's a great paper.
It's an extremely important paper to understand why, at best, they're very, very, very weak evidence.
My issue is when he said, I remember this so clearly, dude. When he said, well, there are valid arguments from silence. Cool, bro. Like, modus tollens is the thing. We get it, bro. But like,
Yeah.
you didn't. Are you making that? Like, have you demonstrated that that's what you're doing? You can't. I can say there's valid appeals to ignorance. It doesn't mean that I am now not making a fallacious appeal to ignorance. So, him just saying, "Oh, there's valid arguments from silence." Cool. Have you shown that yours is? That was the weird part to me. I was like, "Yeah, that's uncontroversial." But like, we're talking about your take here. So anyway.
Yeah.
most Christian scholars, I think, so people like Dale Allison, for example, believe that this didn't actually happen.
Well, I'm not interested in what Allison's going to say.
The door that this opens.
What I'm interested in is what the data says.
The door-
So
well,
if we have the historical reportage model, right?
But you keep saying we have this model.
That's fine. Let me give you some evidence for the historical reportage model.
Sure.
If this model is true, one of the things I would expect to see would be things like undesigned coincidences within the Gospels.
Yeah.
Tiny little interlocking
Okay, for the sake of time, I understand what you're saying. So I think
This is I was so frustrated at this point, because it's just like, any moment that I tried to grab the conversation back to get into giving an argument or a response, it's just like, well, okay, let's just go somewhere else now. And man, I don't fault dialects for it. It's just this the format made this really hard. This is a really hard prompt for this.
Well,
format.
you're trying to argue entire books worth of information in a couple minutes, and that's not easy to do. Plus, he's trying to combat that while learning it on the fly.
Yeah.
And it's just a very difficult format.
a lot in the Gospels is historically reliable and a lot is not. Things like undesigned coincidences
So
are
you're
really
taking a pericope by pericope approach to this, or how is what methodology?
I'm taking
are you
a story by story. I don't think that the
I
graves.
think I don't think that's a good methodology.
I don't think that the graves of Jerusalem were opened. I don't
So,
think that there were people
that's
walking
fine.
around
I
the city of
understand where you're
Jerusalem.
coming
But if
from.
that's the case, then that means that at least the author of Matthew is willing to invent
I don't
stories
think that's the
of
case.
resurrection
Well,
in order
hold
to
on,
make a
you're making a
theological
big
point.
inference there, right?
Well, hold on.
Because
Okay.
I know that you like to talk, for instance, you like to talk about the flight to Egypt, and you like to
Sure,
say that Matthew invented the flight to Egypt.
Luke.
No, Luke's the one that doesn't mention it.
Did
Matthew's
they, wait,
mentioned it.
pause for a sec.
Sorry.
Okay,
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you? I had this line that I was hoping would be in there, but it's not there.
Yeah,
Do you
I remember
remember-
that line. I remember
Do you-
that line.
Darn it. Okay, so for chat, during this conversation, there was a part where Alex wanted to segue into contradictions, and I stopped them and I went, "Okay, yeah, let's talk about your favorite one." And then I went into giving his argument for him, and this is what you're about to hear. But
I don't remember you saying this lines up with my memory, but
Tim,
again,
you
I could be
remember this,
wrong.
yeah.
I remember that. Now, was it this specific? Because you went up there twice.
It was for this one.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that line though. Yeah,
Darn.
yeah.
That line was fire.
It
I'm
was
just
good.
sad. That's all.
It
Keep going. I'm
was
sorry.
good. I remember that.
Oh, you're good.
No, Luke's the one that doesn't mention it. Matthew's the one that mentions it.
Sorry, Matthew.
It's okay,
Yeah,
it's okay.
sorry.
Yeah, Matthew, and then typically the way you run this argument is Matthew invented the flight to Egypt. Luke doesn't mention it. The reason why Luke doesn't mention it is because it didn't happen. Matthew mentions it, and he tells us why to put Jesus into prophecy. Here's a counter hypothesis.
Sure,
What if it's just the case that Matthew is not making up historical facts and he's doing some sort of midrash? And what I mean by this is that he's looking at this historical thing.
Shout out Coley.
Hey, yeah, my
Oh,
homie.
Boy, Cole, dude, I love you, man.
Shout out Coley.
That happened, the flight to Egypt, and taking this Hosea passage, which, by the way, would be a kind of a clunky passage to use if you wanted to make up a historical fact for prophecy. Because that Hosea passage is not inherently...
I think we might be getting slightly off, but I have to be allowed to speak here. I think we're getting slightly off topic. The problem with the birth narrative story is not just that a story is being invented to fulfill prophecy, although we're told that that's why it's done. The problem is that it contradicts the other account. That
Well,
the
I'm
family
totally fine with
the
that.
family
So
saying
if you look at the birth narratives altogether, I think there's room for one discrepancy, and that is
Egypt
that
and
Luke
Jerusalem.
doesn't mention it.
Well, Luke says that they go to the temple.
What?
Luke says that they go to the temple.
Yeah,
So hold on.
I'm going to agree with you.
Let me finish. Luke says that the family go to the temple and present Jesus in Jerusalem. Matthew says that they go to Egypt. They're very far away from each other. And we're told that they stay in Egypt until after the death of Herod. This is a contradiction.
So again, I actually agree.
Okay, pause. You've been voted out.
Luke, you traitor. Or Coley, you traitor. I don't know why I said Luke. Coley, you traitor. No, I'm just joking. You traitor,
Dude,
bro.
no, I had a lot of time with him. 6
You did.
minutes.
You did. And honestly, I think the reason that he didn't call you back up is not because he was afraid of you. I don't want to say that, but because I think you put him on the ropes enough that is like too combative and to the point where he wasn't sure how to navigate a conversation. And I think that might have been a reason he didn't call you back up. Because I think if given enough time here, I don't know where he would have took this conversation from this point. I just don't think you were allowed to really flesh it out.
It would have been this is what probably would have happened, right? It would have been further more of a discussion on gospel reliability. We would have talked about the reliability of the birth narratives, all these contradictions, blah, blah, blah. I would have responded. At the end, I actually even said, hey, by the way, I'm about to agree with you on something, which is like Alex is going to say Luke didn't know about the flight to Egypt. But that's not a problem for me, right? Like Luke not mentioning the flight to Egypt and getting that wrong is not a problem for gospel reliability. It actually totally makes sense with the historical reportage model that I put up and the reconstruction that I put up. Because if Luke was a companion of Paul and he's writing to Theophilus and all these other people, right? He doesn't have direct access to Mary, the people that were involved in the flight to Egypt. But Matthew, likewise, would have access to that stuff. That's like, you're going to expect to see that type of discrepancy between the texts, right? That's the thing I wanted to get out there before I got voted out. And then it probably would have just been throwing more contradictions at me and then me eventually going, okay, I can answer all these. Can we get to the positive case now?
Yeah. And that's the problem with these kind of debate formats is like the atheist has an advantage of the so-called contradictions that they can run down so much time going through it or eventually get you to a point where it's like, I don't have an answer to that specific contradiction. That doesn't mean there's one. And so they can almost like look for gotchas with the contradictions. And there's never a place where you can actually sit down and talk about the positives. Like, how does Luke know this? How does Matthew know this? How do they get this right? And you don't really get the flip side where you're putting the atheists on the hills and like they have to answer the question on the positive claims that the gospels are making. And I think that's what we see a lot in these kind of formats these days. Now, so the next one is me. Now, before I pull myself up, I want to say to the chat, defending myself, I don't know if I need it, but holy hell, this is the most nervous I've ever been for anything in my life. Like I fought in a cage. I wasn't half as nervous fighting in a cage as I was for doing this. I sat in the chair. I had tunnel vision. I couldn't see properly. I was shaking. I was sweating. So give me some grace if I say something stupid.
No. And legit here, like, we all know what John's intellectual prowess is and everything like that. And so I just want to like second the whole grace thing and everything because it was pretty nerve-wracking being in that room. There are tons of lights, tons of cameras on you. We're sitting there for 4 hours, right? Having to get your points ready and everything. There's a lot of pressure. So just keep that in mind.
But it is what it is. Let's get into it.
Your seat.
Pompeii?
So there's one point you kind of keep going back to is the opening of the graves. And you're saying we're not seeing that anywhere in history. And I kind of agree with what Dan was saying, is this is an argument of silence. So we don't see anywhere in history the destruction of Pompeii being written down through Vesuvius. This is a huge event.
Sure.
Why don't we see that?
But if we had accounts describing Pompeii around the time that happened and they just didn't mention it, you don't think that would be a bit suspect?
Well, we don't see anything talking about the destruction of Pompeii.
Sure, but if we had accounts that were written about Pompeii at the time of the destruction and they didn't mention it, do you think that would be weird?
Yeah, I do think that would be
So
a
we
little
have
bit odd.
accounts written about Jesus in Jerusalem at the time that this extraordinary event was supposed to take place, and they didn't even think to mention it.
So
Can I tell you why I think the story's in there?
Sure.
Because Jesus is supposed to be the firstborn of the dead. And Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet in the Synoptic Gospels, predicting that the end of the world is going to come soon, the general resurrection of the dead, and Jesus is going to be the firstborn of the dead. So I think Matthew invents this story so that these people rise from their grave, but they don't start appearing to people until after the resurrection, because
did they cut out something? Because I remember us talking about more things before we got to the point of Matthew.
I'm trying to remember.
Like I remember more of a conversation, and then he said, "Do you want to know why I think?" And I said, "Sure," but maybe I'm wrong. Again, my memory probably not the best from this event.
Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, and this is the general resurrection. The reason it's invented is because, of course, after Jesus dies, there is no end of the world, there is no apocalypse, and so Matthew invents this story in order to fulfill that.
I think that's one hypothesis, but I think when we're looking at the Gospels, we have another hypothesis. We have this fact that, we mentioned the undesigned coincidences. You're familiar with that, right? We have the fact that they go through a lot of historical information so they get geography right. You agree with this?
Yeah, yeah.
So would you say that we have authors that are located within this area during this time period?
I don't know if I can say that with confidence. I think it depends on which gospel you're talking about.
Well, let's just go like the Synoptics.
The Synoptics. So who do you think is the author of, say, the Gospel of Mark?
I would say it's Mark.
That was John Mark, the author of...
Yeah.
Now, why do you think that?
Well, I think you're just kind of brushing off my question, though. Do you think the authors were in that time period during that? I'm happy with that.
No, that was good.
I'm happy because I didn't ask him who the original authors were. I wasn't even focused on that at all. I was asking a very specific question. I'm like, the people who wrote the Gospels, did they live in this time period? Were they in this area? And he shifted to original authorship. Now, even if I could say that, okay, it wasn't written by Mark, my question still stands. Was it these people in this area? And he wasn't answering that question. So I was kind of happy just being like, you're not answering my question. Let's go back to it. Period. During that, in the location.
I think even if that's the case, I think that the events were written down decades after they happened.
Okay, but we are saying...
But I'm happy to... Let's say that I granted it. Okay. So these accounts are at least based on eyewitness testimony. Fine. So what?
Well, if we have people who are recording true information off eyewitness testimony...
Then why does that true information often contradict itself?
In what way does it contradict itself?
What's the date of Jesus' death? The Synoptics say that it was on the Passover. John has it before the Passover.
So there's a long, convoluted answer to that. It's how they use idioms in the language. I don't want to get into that
What
right now.
time did Jesus die?
So I don't want to
Mark
get
says that it's 9 in the morning. John explicitly tells us that he's still standing before Pilate at midday.
So here's the thing. I'm going to grant you contradictions. Is that not what we would expect to see from people recording real events?
Not on these matters, I think.
Why not?
I've made this argument myself. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe we'd expect people to sort of misunderstand the points. But if it's clear that the reason why John is putting the death of Jesus before the Passover is to present him as the Passover lamb, then I think we have reason to suspect that it's been done on purpose. In other words, if we can explain why these contradict each other because the authors have different intentions, I think that proposes...
Tim, you said to me after this that he wouldn't let me talk.
Yeah.
I agree with you now.
Yeah, he very much was steamrolling.
There's a better hypothesis as to why they contradict.
So specifically on Jesus' day, I don't have off the top of my head. I know there's an explanation for that. Maybe we could talk later and I could show it to you, but I don't have the top of my head
Okay,
for that.
when Jesus is on the cross, there are two thieves next to him, right? What do they say?
So this is a gish gallop.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah, that's a gish gallop.
Yeah, the same thing I told you that what would have happened if our conversation continued. He would have just kept throwing and throwing and throwing and throwing and throwing until he eventually got to something that I couldn't have off the top of my head, right? And that's what he's trying to do with you at this point too, right?
Right, and where I wish I would have performed better is I wish I would have been a little bit more aggressive with like, you're gish galloping. You still haven't answered my question. We still haven't looked at it. You're just kind of moving to these points of contradictions. You're bringing up contradictions. And there's another point is like, I said, let me grant you the contradictions. And he just kind of ignored that and just, well, let's bring up more contradictions.
Yeah.
One condemns him and one says, don't condemn him.
That's what happens in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, which are earlier, both of them mock him on the cross.
Yeah, I don't see that being an issue.
You don't see that as being an issue.
Why would that be an issue?
Because this is quite an important theological point that's being made. Jesus is forgiving his enemies right before his death. This seems to me, if the earlier Gospels, Mark and Matthew, say that this didn't happen, and explicitly says that the people who were on the cross next to him were mocking him, this is a story that Luke has invented.
But
why would Luke invent a story like that to make it
Can I say something quick? What Alex just said is the reason I am so outspoken about the historical reportage model of the Gospels in my work, and why I'm against like the minimal facts arguments and the typical ways that scholars like Lacona and others will go about addressing contradictions. What Alex just said is regurgitating what some even conservative Christian scholars will say about the Gospels, which is, well, yeah, they're just changing the history a little bit to do a literary device for this theological point. And that only serves to Alex's point here, which is the reason why when I say the historical reportage model of the Gospels is so important, it's because I think we can actually show the opposite is true, that they did not feel the freedom to do this.
Yeah, and that's actually something, since we gathered together and started looking at this and prepping for this, that's been my primary focus, is like the historic reporters model. So that's the only thing I've been focused on since then, when I actually have time to sit down and study. So I'm actually full on board with you on this one. I think it's probably one of the strongest arguments that we can do for the Gospels at this point.
Yeah.
The gospel writers are willing to invent things in order to make a theological
I
point.
think it's just assuming
Okay,
invention.
pause. You've been voted out by the majority.
So yeah, I'm still not happy with my performance, but it's not as bad as I thought it was.
No, I think
No, dude. Everything we said to you after the debate was over and we were driving you home, bro.
you did something that I could not do, which was you
Be
did a
sexy.
very good job of keeping Alex like on point and like being able to just call him out really quickly when he tries to reframe.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like I said, I was happy with that. I was happy, but we didn't get a chance to really get into anything, and he got me so far off of the topic I actually wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Plus, forgetting about Pliny. There's a lot of areas. Lesson learned. Next one, we'll do better. All right, this is the last one. This will be Than's last performance. This is
Ironically, this was actually my first interaction with him.
Oh, they edited it. They
Second
switched
one-
it.
Yeah, they switched it. So the first one you guys saw was actually the second one that was recorded.
Oh,
This one you're about to see is the first one that was recorded.
Majority.
Good to see you again.
All right. Two things. Have you heard of
no, because he just said, "Good to see you again."
No, they added that in.
Oh, clever editing.
Yeah.
I guess you don't see his mouth say that.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, that is clever editing.
All right. Two things. Have you heard of the cloud rider motif?
No, I don't think so.
Yes, this is the first one, because we were talking about as Christology.
Yep.
I didn't want to go
I
up.
was
For,
right on.
remember, I did not want to go up for this one, but
And
anybody
and
handled
they
this.
and they edited out when you said, because I remember, dude, on your second one, you were like, okay, you're like, nerves are out. Now we can kind of get back to what we were saying. I
Yeah.
remember you said that. That they didn't
Yeah.
include that. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, the cloud rider motif.
Yeah. Okay. Then I'm assuming you've heard of like the two powers in heaven motif.
No.
Okay, there's a Jewish historian named Alan Segal. He wrote a book called The Two Powers in Heaven. And what he talks about is there's this weird thing happening in the Bible where there's almost like two Yahweh figures that they point to. So some verses, for instance, will say like Yahweh rained down fire from Yahweh. And so Philo of Alexandria in the Second Temple period talks about this two powers in heaven motif. And he says like there's two Yahwehs. There's the first power and the second power, but they're both Yahweh. It's almost like a sort of proto-Trinitarian view. That's one thing that I'll just kind of put there for now. Another puzzle piece here is you've heard about the cloud rider motif. So in the Ugaritic texts, in the Baal cycle, we see Baal referenced as the one who rides the clouds. And I think you can see that actually adopted by the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible as well. So Psalm 104 is like an exaltation psalm and actually talks about Yahweh being the one that rides the clouds in heaven. He is the king. I see that as kind of a polemic of calling Yahweh.
So people who watch my debates, have you noticed a new argument I've been using?
Let's go.
I'm just curious. This is it. This is where I got it from. So props to Than.
Yahweh the king over Baal. Are we on the same page there?
Sure.
Okay. In Daniel 7, you'll see a messianic passage there about how God will come down, and you'll see the Son of Man come, riding in the clouds of heaven. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom.
Do you think Daniel thought that the Son of Man was going to be God, since he says that he's riding on a cloud?
This is a really interesting point.
I
And
don't think that he did, because he was a Jewish writer.
I lean on saying yes, but I don't know if I can say
Do
that
you
with
think
like absolute certainty.
The
Is that
prophet
fair?
Daniel was expecting the Messiah to be God.
I think so.
Oh, sorry,
but
the Son of Man to be God.
who is that's a motif only applied to God. So you have this cloud rider motif and
so
the
but-
human.
And this is, and I talked to you about this after the live. This is where I wish you would have made him focus on the two powers rather than on the Daniel 7 kind of thing. That was my only contention out of everything you did, is just like,
Yeah.
he wanted to go to Daniel and you went to Daniel with him.
Well, there is a thing that got edited out there. Tim, you pointed. I remember saying this because I remember Tim, you coming up to me and being like, "I like how you broadcasted that, right?" Because when I talked about Daniel, I actually did this other thing where I was like, "Oh, by the way, I'm also aware of all these other debates about dating, authorship, blah blah blah, on this side of the stuff. That's not really relevant here." And I went back. So, because the thing is, I wanted to answer that question and just get it out of the way and get back on track. And the reason why is because, at least in my head, if I didn't, I was worried that that accusation of like running away from the question could come up. And so something as simple as that, where I can just be honest, I'll just answer the question and get back on track, kind of a thing. That was at least my mindset there.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair.
By the way, I do think that there are multiple things which people, even in Jesus' time, thought only God could do. Things like forgiving sins. And when Jesus does these things, he's not doing so in order to prove that he's God, but in order to prove that the Son of Man has the authority to do that.
I completely agree. This isn't that kind of an argument. This is an identification thing.
So where's Jesus claiming to be
Yes,
God?
that's where I'm going. So we have these puzzle pieces in place.
Sure.
If you fast forward to Mark's gospel, and I'm going to use Mark.
Let's do Mark.
Jesus before Caiaphas in Mark's gospel, Caiaphas asks him, "Who are you?" And instead of just explicitly saying, "I am God," Jesus quotes Daniel 7, saying he is the Son of Man, the human one, who will ride on the clouds, and calls himself the second power. So you have this two powers in heaven motif. The two powers, they're both God, and the cloud rider motif, and the Son of Man.
I'm not impressed right now. In all honesty, it looks like I'm not impressed, but the truth is I'm like, stop shaking. Stop shaking.
And you're really staring through
poop your
either the
pants.
floor or like the wall. Like that's really what's happening right there.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, staring like just off into space.
Man, he's quoting Daniel 7 to identify himself. After that, Caiaphas tears his robe and cries blasphemy.
I do think that Jesus is making some pretty extraordinary claims to himself, such as being the Son of Man, but I still don't see why he's claiming to be God. If this were the way that he was trying to reveal his divinity to people, it'd be a strange and convoluted way to do it. Psalm 82 also talks about God presiding over a
At
council.
this moment right here, I looked at the clock and I was like, there's nothing I can do. He changed the conversation and I knew there was nothing I could do there because I only had 5 seconds left.
He's also making a big assumption there. It's a convoluted way for him to call himself. It's not. To a Second Temple Jew, this is
Clearly
Caiaphus
not
right
convoluted.
away.
Somebody ripped his robe. Right.
Yeah. Like he wasn't confused at all. What else do you need? He just committed blasphemy. Like it was right in front of his face. 2,000 years later, over 2,000 years of changing languages and things like that.
Alex just shifted to a divine hiddenness type argument, not was Jesus claiming to be God argument.
Of gods, saying you shall be called gods.
I think there's a mistake here.
And Jesus quotes that psalm when he's referring to his relationship with the Father
I understand what you're
in the
saying.
Gospel of
The
John.
issue
So
is
even if in the Old Testament you have these
two
sort of
hypotheses,
lesser
though,
gods,
right?
Jesus is
You
only
have a
claiming to be that.
hypothesis, right? That this is not a Christological implication, and I have mine. And I get what you're saying, where you're coming from. But to the ancient author, how obvious would this be?
So the best we have here is Jesus claiming to be the Son of Man, and that might indicate that he might be God.
He ignored that question, right? To the ancient author, how obvious would that be? Ignores it, goes to his, well, it's not obvious to me thing, and
and then that's not applying, good hermeneutics, not applying good history. You got to understand how they interpret it, how they understood it.
Yeah.
Evidence we wish we did have. We go off the evidence that we do have.
That's right. And I don't think that there's any point at which Jesus says.
So you're saying that this is not
All right,
evidence?
guys, that's time.
evidence, but not good enough. It's so nice. I'm sorry, I'm going on.
At least he admits it's evidence.
I don't even know what that last line, I don't even know what that means. If I'm going to really translate what that means in academic-ese, right? What he's really just saying is, hey, this is evidence, but the prior probability that Jesus claimed to be God is really low. Like, that's the best way to interpret that. And then the question is just going to be like, why should I think that the priors are really low there?
That's it, boys. That's all the performances. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. If you want to watch more, you can click one of these and you can keep watching.